when George R.R. Martin wrote the massacres that shocked a generation of viewers. Critics called it excessive, too dark, too cruel to be believed. Martin's answer was simple. He hadn't invented the cruelty. He'd merely borrowed it and dulled the edges. From a dinner invitation that ended in a boy's beheading, to a weapon so terrible it set the open sea alight, to a winter's night when hospitality itself became the murder weapon. These are 4 documented events drawn from Scotland, Byzantium, and England. Every one of them happened, and every one of them is worse than fiction dared to be. To understand what happened in that hall, you first have to understand what the Douglas name meant. Scotland in 1440 was, on paper, ruled by a king. In practice, it was ruled by whichever noble house could raise the most spears fastest, and none stood taller than the Black Douglases, a dynasty with its own courts, its own armies, and a habit of treating royal authority as a polite suggestion. The reigning king was a child. James II had inherited the crown at 6 years old, and the men who governed in his name, chief among them Sir William Crichton, watched the teenage Earl of Douglas grow into his inheritance with something closer to dread than deference. William Douglas was 16. He rode with a retinue larger than the king's own guard. He answered to no one, and everyone in Edinburgh knew it. So Crichton extended an invitation. Come to the castle. Dine with young James, as equals, as a gesture of unity between the crown and its most dangerous subject. William came. So did his younger brother David, barely into his teens himself. The 2 boys sat beside the 10-year-old king through course after course, roasted meats, spiced wine, the ordinary theater of medieval hospitality, and by every surviving account the evening passed warmly enough. James, still a child himself, seemed genuinely fond of his older cousin. Then the doors opened, and something was carried the length of the hall and set upon the table in front of William Douglas. A bull's head, black as scorched wood in 15th century Scotland. That image required no explanation. It was a death sentence, served instead of dessert. The Douglas brothers were seized at the table, dragged, still in their dining clothes, into the castle yard beyond. A trial followed treason, the charge, though no meaningful evidence was ever produced, and it lasted only as long as it took the axe to be readied. Within the hour, both boys were beheaded on Castle Hill, in the cold, in front of witnesses. The boy king, by multiple contemporary accounts, wept and pleaded for the killing to stop. Nobody listened to him either. Whether James was complicit or simply a crowned child too powerless to intervene remains genuinely unresolved, a monarch's authority used as cover for a murder he may not have wanted. What is beyond dispute is the method. Warmth extended purely to lower a guard, and a feast turned into an execution chamber. When Martin needed a template for the Red Wedding, Edinburgh Castle had already written it, a century and a half before the Reformation, and 5 centuries before Westeros existed at all. By the early 8th century, the armies of the Umayyad Caliphate had done something no power had managed in over 1,000 years. They had conquered Persia, swept across North Africa, and pushed into Spain, unraveling 3 continents in under a century. Constantinople, the last great capital of the Roman world, was what remained standing between that momentum and the rest of Europe. In 717, the Caliphate came for it directly. An armada numbering close to 2,000 vessels encircled the city by sea, while a land army choked off every route by road. Inside the walls, bread was rationed, wells were watched, and the population braced for a siege that history suggested they had no way of surviving. They had one advantage nobody outside the city walls had ever seen used: Greek fire, a liquid weapon pumped through bronze tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships, whose exact formula was guarded so closely that emperors reportedly took it to their graves rather than risk it falling into enemy hands. Historians still argue over its precise chemistry today. What the Arab fleet experienced needed no chemistry lesson to understand. Flame that clung to timber, to sailcloth, to skin, and burned even as it floated across open water. A green-tinged fire crawling across the waves as though the sea itself had ignited. Chronicles from both sides describe entire squadrons consumed within minutes, sailors leaping overboard only to discover the water offered no escape from the burning. The siege broke. Constantinople held and would go on holding for another 7 centuries. Western Europe, largely unaware of how close the calculation had run, bought itself the better part of a millennium to develop in relative peace. Whether Greek fire counts as a marvel of Byzantine engineering or an early instrument of horror is a question the Byzantines themselves never bothered answering. They simply kept the secret generation after generation and let the silence do the talking. Highland winters do not negotiate. Wind that strips exposed skin raw within minutes. Snow that can swallow a grown man whole between one step and the next, into weather like this. In the closing days of January 1692, a company of roughly 120 government soldiers under Captain Robert Campbell arrived at the homes of Clan MacDonald of Glencoe, requesting shelter for the winter. This was not an unusual request. The Highlands operated under an ancient code of hospitality that bordered on the sacred. A guest once welcomed under a roof was owed absolute protection, whatever quarrel might exist beyond that threshold. The MacDonalds knew Campbell's men carried orders connected to a recent oath of allegiance the clan chief had sworn late, a technicality seized on by a government in Edinburgh eager to make an example of a clan it considered insufficiently loyal to the new king, William of Orange. But the code was the code. For nearly 2 weeks, the MacDonalds fed these soldiers from their own stores, warmed them at their own hearths, and played cards with them by candlelight through the long dark evenings. In the small hours of the February thrate, on written orders sent from the government, the soldiers rose from the beds their hosts had given them and turned their weapons on the household. Men were shot where they slept. The clan chief, Alasdair MacIain, was killed as he rose to dress, his wife stripped and mutilated in the chaos that followed. Others fled into the storm outside, chased through blackness and snow by men who had only hours before been their guests and companions, and many who escaped the blades simply froze to death in the open, wandering blind through a blizzard with no shelter left to run to. 38 MacDonalds died that night, and in the bitter days after, hunted down not by strangers, but by men they had called friend across a fortnight of firelight. Were the soldiers monsters or simply instruments? Men following orders from a government determined to punish disloyalty regardless of the cost? The Highlands have argued that question for over 300 years without settling it, and the ruins of Glencoe still sit in the glen as a fairly blunt answer of their own. For 30 years, England turned its blade on itself. Two branches of the same royal bloodline, York and Lancaster, fought a war that consumed entire generations of nobility, fathers and sons at times dying on opposing sides of the same field, the crown changing hands so many times that loyalty itself became a fatal gamble. Few figures to emerge from that war unsettle historians quite as consistently as Edward of Lancaster. Heir to the Lancastrian throne, born into a childhood spent almost entirely amid siege, flight, and slaughter, he was rumored even by contemporaries to be no true son of his weak and periodically insane father, Henry VI. Whispers that shadowed him his entire short life. Raised largely by his mother, the formidably ruthless Margaret of Anjou, in courts and camps rather than nurseries, the boy grew up learning strategy and survival before he learned much else. By the age of 13, chroniclers of the period claim Edward spoke of his father's captured enemies, not with the caution expected of an heir, but with open appetite, reportedly proposing methods of execution for defeated Yorkist lords with an enthusiasm that alarmed even battle-hardened men around him. He never lived to test what kind of king he might have made. He was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, still 17, his ambitions buried with him in the abbey there, alongside the last real hope of a Lancastrian throne. The shadow he left, however, proved considerably longer than his life. When Shakespeare needed a template for cruelty dressed in royal blood, and centuries later, when Martin needed a model for a teenage king who mistook executions for entertainment, England's own civil war had already supplied the character fully formed in the historical record. A bull's head on a banqueting table. A sea set alight by a secret no empire would surrender. A blizzard used to disguise a betrayal 13 days in the making. A boy who dreamed of executions before he'd finished growing into his own crown. 4 true stories, 4 different centuries, 4 different corners of the medieval world, and not one of them required a single detail invented to earn its place beside the fiction that later borrowed from it. Westeros was never the darkest place in this story. It was only the version with dragons and considerably less snow.